The Gewehr 41 was one of the most expensive infantry rifles Germany built in the Second World War, and the most quietly hated. By the time the first batches reached units of Heeresgruppe Nord in the winter of 1941, the rifle was already failing in the field. The fix, the Gewehr 43, was a rifle Walther's engineers built in defiance of the rules the German army had spent 2 years giving them. Where they got the answer, and what it cost Germany to admit it, is what this video is about. To understand why Germany ever needed a new rifle, you have to look at what the rest of the world was doing while the Wehrmacht was still issuing the Kar 98K. The Americans had standardized the M1 Garand in January 1936, more than 4 years before the war in Europe began. It was a semi-automatic, 8-shot rifle that fired as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The Soviets moved even faster. The SVT-38 entered service in December 1938, and its successor, the SVT-40, was adopted in April 1940. By the time German troops crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, more than 1 million SVT-40s had already been built. The Wehrmacht standard rifle, the Karabiner 98K, was a bolt-action design with a 5-round internal magazine. Reliable, accurate, and cheap to produce at around 70 Reichsmarks. Also a generation behind everything its enemies were carrying. In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, German infantry began running into Red Army units issued the SVT-40 in significant numbers. Field reports describe Soviet sections where a single rifleman could put down sustained, deadly fire that, until that point, only a German MG-34 team had been able to match. The reports reached the Oberkommando des Heer by late summer 1941. A request for a German semi-automatic rifle, sitting quietly in development since 1940, became a priority. What the Wehrmacht needed, the Heereswaffenamt was going to design. What the Heereswaffenamt was going to design, no engineer had ever been asked to build before. What the Heereswaffenamt asked of Mauser and Walther in 1940 had never been asked of anyone before. The design brief came with 3 rules. No gas port could be drilled into the barrel. No moving parts could be exposed on the outside of the rifle. And if the automatic mechanism failed in combat, the soldier had to be able to keep firing as a bolt action. Each rule, on its own, made some kind of sense. Together, they ruled out the working semi-automatic design every other army in the world had already adopted. The Americans tapped gas through a port in the barrel. The Soviets tapped gas through a port in the barrel. Every working design in the world tapped gas through a port in the barrel. If you were an engineer at Walther or Mauser, sitting in front of that brief, you knew the only working solution was the one the army had specifically banned. Both firms reached for the same 40-year-old workaround. It was a system patented in 1903 by a Danish designer named Søren Hansen Bang. Bang wrapped a metal cone around the muzzle. When a bullet exited, the cone caught the escaping gases, redirected them backward, and used the pressure to push an operating rod hidden inside the wooden forend. The rod cycled the action. No hole in the barrel. Nothing visibly moving. The Bang system had been rejected by every army that had ever looked at it. The cone trapped powder fouling, mud, and ice. After a few hundred rounds in field conditions, it jammed open or stuck closed. For the soldier holding it, a fouled cone meant a deadly liability in his hands. The engineers knew this. They built it anyway, because the rules left them nothing else. By 1941, both rifles existed and only one of them was even allowed to leave the factory. Mauser's G41M followed the brief exactly. It had the Bang cone, no exposed mechanism, and a fully functioning bolt-action backup. The Heereswaffenamt ordered an initial production run of 6,673 units for field trials. Of those 6,673 rifles, roughly 1,673 were eventually returned to the factory marked unusable, nearly 1 in 4. The G41M was withdrawn from further development before the end of 1942. Mauser, the company whose name had defined German infantry rifles for 50 years, had been beaten in its own competition. What most people don't realize is that Walther had already started ignoring the brief while Mauser was still trying to satisfy it. The Walther engineers decided the rule against exposed moving parts was unenforceable in any working design, and the bolt-action backup added weight without value. Their rifle, the G41W, had a manual cocking handle on the side and no bolt-action fallback. The Army accepted it because it worked more often than the Mauser version. By 1942, the G41W was entering limited service. with production figures climbing into the tens of thousands across the next 2 years. The Kar 98K cost around 70 Reichsmarks per rifle. The G41W costs significantly more because of the precision machining, the heavier barrel, and the additional parts. If you were a Wehrmacht infantryman in 1942, the rifle in your hands cost the army more, weighed more, fired more slowly when fouled, and was harder to maintain than the bolt action it was supposed to replace. The first place the G41W would prove how badly it failed was where Germany could afford to fail the least. There is one part of the G41 story that the surviving veterans of the Eastern Front never had to be asked twice to talk about. In late 1941, the first significant batches of G41W rifles reached units of Heeresgruppe Nord, the German army group operating in the forests and lakes south of Leningrad. The G41W weighed nearly 5 kilograms loaded, almost a full kilogram more than the Kar 98K. Its 10-round magazine was fixed in place. Reloading meant pushing 2 5-round stripper clips down through the open action by hand, one after the other, in whatever weather and tactical situation the soldier was in. Around Lake Ilmen and the marshes leading to the Demyansk pocket, where the German 16th Army would spend the next 18 months either besieging Soviet positions or being besieged in their own, the G41W found the worst possible conditions for the bang cone. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero in January 1942. Snow blew into every weapon, every man, every piece of equipment. The cone collected snow, freezing slush, and powder residue at every shot. After a day's fighting, it jammed. And that's when the rifle stopped being a rifle. The Walther design had no bolt-action workaround. A jammed G41W was just a heavy, expensive piece of metal. If you were a soldier in mittens lying in the snow at -20 degrees, you could not feed stripper clips into a fouled rifle quickly enough to stay alive. Soldiers began trading the G41W back for Kar 98KS at the first opportunity. Captured Soviet SVT-40S were valued more highly than the issued German rifle. The new weapon was a brutal failure on the front it had been designed to win. By spring 1942, the engineers at Walther had already started looking at something else. What they were looking at had not been built by a German company. It had been pulled off the body of a dead Soviet soldier. To understand the rifle Walther built next, you have to understand why their own engineers stopped fighting the Heereswaffenamt and started ignoring it. From the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa onward, German units captured Soviet SVT-40S in significant numbers. A steady stream of examples made their way back to the design offices at Walther. The SVT-40 used a short-stroke gas piston. A small port was drilled through the barrel about a third of the way back from the muzzle. When the bullet passed that port, a fraction of the gases bled off and pushed a short piston rearward. That piston struck the bolt carrier and cycled the action. The system was simple, fast, easy to clean, and largely immune to muzzle fouling because the gas tap was nowhere near the muzzle. It was also exactly what the Heereswaffenamt had banned in 1940. The brief said no hole in the barrel. The SVT-40 had a hole in the barrel. That hole was the entire reason the rifle worked. In 1942, the Walther engineers built a replacement. They kept the G41W's receiver, magazine geometry, and external profile. They removed the bang cone. They drilled a port into the barrel, fitted a short-stroke piston modeled on the SVT-40, and made the magazine detachable. By the end of 1943, Walther had delivered approximately 3,200 of what would be called the Gewehr 43. Production climbed to more than 400,000 by 1945. The Heereswaffenamt accepted it. The brief that it specifically banned, every working solution was quietly set aside. Nobody in the Army's Ordnance Department wanted to write a memo explaining that the rifle they had just approved was a copy of the rifle their soldiers had been pulling off Soviet bodies for 2 years. So nobody wrote one. The rules that had killed the G41 were simply forgotten. But here's the thing about a working rifle that arrives too late. The G43 was a better weapon than the G41 in every measurable way. The detachable 10-round magazine, the simplified production with stamped metal parts, the gas system that actually worked. By every internal metric, the G43 was the rifle the Wehrmacht should have had in 1941. By May 1944, Walther was also delivering G43s fitted with the ZF-4 telescopic sight. Roughly 46,000 scoped G43s were issued across 1944 and 1945. As a designated marksman rifle, the G43/ZF4 finally found a role where its capability mattered. But Germany in 1943 was not Germany in 1941. Strategic bombing had begun damaging production. Raw materials were running short. The G43 still cost significantly more per unit than the K98K, and the average German infantryman in 1944 was a teenager pulled from the Volkssturm, given a few weeks of training and sent toward a collapsing front. The brutal reality was that what the Wehrmacht needed was not a slightly better infantry rifle. It needed 3 times as many of any rifle it could possibly produce. When the war ended in May 1945, more than 400,000 G43s had been built. Almost none stayed in German hands for long. The Czech People's Army inherited a significant number and kept them in service as sniper rifles for years. In East Germany, the Volkspolizei, the border troops, and eventually the National People's Army carried reworked G43s, stamped with a sunburst proof mark. Photographs from the East Berlin Guard ceremony in 1971 show NVA Honor Guard soldiers still carrying the rifle, almost 3 decades after Walther stopped making it. The Heereswaffenamt's 3 rules in 1940 produced 2 failures, 1 disaster, and finally 1 rifle that worked. By the time the Wehrmacht had it, the war was already lost. The brief that had been written to give Germany an edge had instead taken 3 years off the clock and handed the Soviets a deadly head start they would never give back. The G41 failed because Walther was forced to design around rules that made the rifle impossible to build right. The Soviet rifle that fixed the problem, the SVT-40, had its own dark story. Stalin handed it to his best men in 1940 and watched almost all of them die with it in their hands. It's on screen now.